of October 2023, Palestine militant groups such as Hamas, Palestine Islamic Jihad, and PFLP launched a surprise rocket barrage and coordinated attack against Israel in what was called Operation Al-Aqsa Storm. Militants fired about 2,200 to 5,000 rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel in a matter of minutes, as a revenge attack for raiding Al-Aqsa Mosque in April of 2023. In response, Israel has launched a counterattack, an operation called Iron Swords, in which it hopes to eliminate militants and regain control of all infiltrated regions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared a full-scale war on Hamas and other militant groups. But what if we say there is another country that might be getting ready to attack Israel, waiting to take its own revenge? This is the Lebanese-Israeli border, also known as the Blue Line. It's the evidence of a truce called the Armistice Agreement between Lebanon and Israel, following a UN Security Council resolution in the year 2000. Since then, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, has maintained a fair amount of peace by governing the Blue Line. But in July of 2023, just a few months ago, tensions escalated to a new high. Security officials from the Israeli Defense Forces released a chilling statement that sent ripples of fear across the globe. They publicly warned that the risk of war with Lebanon, particularly the Hezbollah, a Lebanon-based Islamist group, was at its highest since the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006. In fact, in August 2023, following weeks of friction with Hezbollah along the Blue Line, Israel threatened to return Lebanon to the Stone Age in any war against Hezbollah, who have undoubtedly become a formidable force in the region. The region already suffers from a pretty volatile geopolitical situation, with Western powers directly or indirectly backing Israel, and the Middle Eastern countries rallying around a fellow Islamic state. This isn't just another regional dispute, it's a powder keg with implications that will reach far across the Middle East in a matter of weeks. Countries rallying around a fellow Islamic state. This isn't just another regional dispute, it's a powder keg with implications that will reach far across the Middle East in a matter of weeks. To understand the complexity of the Israeli-Lebanon tensions in 2023, we need to go back to the origins of this ancestral conflict. It all began in the twilight of the once mighty Ottoman Empire. The territories that would later become Israel and Lebanon were the first integral parts of this sprawling empire. But in the aftermath of World War I, the Ottoman Empire crumbled, and a new era dawned. The British and the French, two big European powers, stepped in and took control of these lands. During the same period, and in the shadows of Europe's darkest chapter, the Holocaust, an increasing number of Jewish immigrants sought refuge in which they believed was their ancestral home, a land promised by God to Abraham in the British Mandate of Palestine, a land where a minority of Jewish settlers coexisted alongside a predominantly Arab population. However, ethnic tensions had already been brewing, especially since the Arab Revolt in the late 1930s, so the British leaned on Jewish police forces to maintain order. But this only further strained the already problematic relations between the Israelis and the Arabs. In 1947, the United Nations stepped in and approved the historic partition plan to carve out separate Jewish and Arab states within Palestine. The Jewish leaders were obviously in full support, but the Arabs vehemently rejected it. Despite the opposition, May 14, 1948 marked the culmination of these tensions as Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This meant Israel was now an independent nation. Before the ink on Israel's declaration even dried, armies from neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, declared war on the newly formed nation. Shockingly, the outgunned and outnumbered Israel managed to hold back the invading forces. As the war continued, Israel secured more arms and gradually reversed the tide of battle. By 1949, the Arab nations were exhausted and both sides agreed to armistice agreements. Yet these agreements were far from peace treaties, and the borders of Israel remained ambiguous. Israel controlled a larger territory than initially allocated under the UN partition plan, incorporating areas promised to Palestinian Arabs. This period gave birth to a pressing refugee crisis, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians forced to flee or expelled from their homes. The echoes of this war ignited further conflicts and tensions in the Middle East across the decades. Within Israel, the war fostered a unifying spirit and made them believe more in the strength of their sovereignty. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, emerged, recruiting militants in Lebanon from the families of Palestine refugees who had fled Israel during the war times in 1948. And this is where the seeds of the First Lebanon War were sown. Before all of this, as difficult as it might be to believe, Lebanon was once a predominantly Christian country. But in the 1940s, due to a high influx of Palestinian refugees, the demographic landscape tilted in favor of the Muslims. This was when social, economic, and political differences between the various communities started becoming more evident and chaotic. But the real spark to the powder was the emergence of Yasser Arafat's PLO, which sought to turn Lebanon into its stronghold and as a base for launching attacks against Israel, a decision that we will soon see backfire later in this story. So spark had met powder, and the fires had started with PLO's movement, but now the fire was about to meet fuel, the greatest catalyst. On April 13, 1975, somewhere in the suburb of Beirut, in a small town known as Ain el Ramana, an altercation between Maronite Christian phalangists, a prominent Maronite Christian militia, and Palestinian militants escalated into violent clashes. This right here marked the start of the Lebanon Civil War. What followed was several deaths and gruesome massacres by the PLO, including the massacre of Maronite Christians in the town of Damour, which took place on January 20th, 1976. While Beirut was busy tearing itself apart, Israel was monitoring the situation closely. You see, the PLO had been a pain in Israel's neck, but because they were deeply based in Lebanon, the only way to thoroughly eliminate them would be to invade Lebanon. But Lebanon was an independent state. You can't just go in and shoot things up. It would be an act of war. So Israel's defense minister, Ariel Sharon, had for a long time been looking for a way in. And even more so now that there was confusion in the enemy's camp. Suddenly, in June 1982, an opportunity presented itself. The Israeli ambassador to England was severely wounded in an assassination attempt that took place in London. Even though the would-be assassins were sworn enemies of the Yasser Arafat-led PLO, this didn't stop Ariel from ordering Israel's forces to march in South Lebanon. Despite With the price of statements that Israeli troops would only advance 40 kilometers, Israeli forces quickly reached Beirut, placing the Lebanese capital under siege. And just like that, Operation Peace in Galilee, also known as the First Lebanon War, was born. Their objectives were twofold. The first was to drive the PLO out of Lebanon, and the second was the installation of a pro-Israel Maronite Christian government. This is how Bashir Gemayel, a Maronite Christian, was elected as Lebanon's new president in August 1982. Tragically, Gemayel was assassinated by a member of the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. In the aftermath, a Maronite-aligned militia gained access to the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut, leading to a harrowing massacre of hundreds of Palestinian men, women, and children. But what did Israel have to do with this? Well, Israeli forces actually aided the militia's entry into the refugee camp. And just like that, the Israel-Lebanon relations were set back another 40 years. Within this turbulent backdrop, a new threat emerged: the Hezbollah. Hezbollah started as a staunch rebel force and Islamic terror group that stood against Israel's occupation of Lebanon. Their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, became pretty famous for speaking out against Israel and soon began to garner support from Israel's enemies like Iran. It wasn't long before they gained significant political influence and military capability. Today they are recognized as one of the world's most heavily armed non-state actors, commanding substantial authority within Lebanon, particularly the Shiite majority regions. The Israeli forces didn't yield though. They remained in southern Lebanon, engaging in a prolonged guerrilla conflict with Hezbollah, where almost 20,000 lost their lives, including 8,000 civilians. But unfortunately, these casualties weren't enough to prevent another war, a second Lebanon war. And it all began on the dark day of July 12th, in what is known today as the Zarit Shtula incident. And this is exactly how it unfolded in real time. On July 12, 2006, Hezbollah initiated diversionary rocket attacks on Israel military positions along the coast and near the Israeli border village of Zarit. Simultaneously, another Hezbollah group crossed the border from Lebanon into Israel, ambushing 2 Israeli army vehicles. Tragically, this attack resulted in the deaths of 3 Israeli soldiers, while 2 were captured. The group's conditions for the release of the captured Israeli soldiers were simple. They wanted the Lebanese prisoners held by Israel, including high-profile figures like Samir Kuntar, and an alleged surviving perpetrator of the Coastal Road massacre, to be released. Israel, on the other hand, wasn't in the mood for dialogue. They responded with massive airstrikes and artillery barrages on various targets across Lebanon. An air and naval blockade was imposed, and Israeli forces initiated a ground invasion of southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's will and might were no match for Israel's superior artillery. In the end, and again, Lebanon bore the brunt of the destruction, with over 1,100 casualties and extensive collateral damages. Approximately 1 million people were displaced in Lebanon and 500,000 Israelis. Finally, light came at the end of the tunnel. The United Nations brokered a ceasefire that came into effect on the 14th of August 2006, bringing an end to the war. Subsequently, the air and naval blockade on Lebanon was lifted on September 8, 2006. This conflict left a lasting impact on the region, contributing to the ongoing tensions and complexities of the Middle East. Today, what keeps the conflict at bay is something called the Blue Line. And now, we're back to where we started. Take a look at this map. Even though there's a clear border between Lebanon and Israel, it's not that simple. It's not a conventional boundary. It was established by the United Nations in 2000 and is patrolled by UNIFIL peacekeepers who are tasked with the heavy burden of maintaining stability. Both Israeli and Lebanese authorities need to notify UNIFIL before any activities like construction or whatever are implemented across the line to avoid misunderstandings. Crossing the Blue Line is a breach of United Nations Security Council resolution. But lately, in June of this year, things have been heating up. You see those tents popping up along the Blue Line? These tents belong to Hezbollah, and they are a clear indication that they are preparing for something, maybe a war. Gajar village sits on the Blue Line and partly in Israel-occupied Golan Heights has become a flashpoint in recent clashes. You see, after Israel's withdrawal in the year 2000, the northern part of Gajar village, which sits between the Lebanon-Israel border, was placed in Lebanese territory. But in the 2006 conflict with Hezbollah, Israeli forces later occupied it, contrary to UN resolutions. Despite calls for Israel to leave by UNIFIL, the Lebanese government and Hezbollah, Israel has only solidified their presence over the past year, reinforcing a wall-hugging Gajar's northern perimeter. This brings us back to the issue of Hezbollah's tents. Historically, Netanyahu has been very cautious when it comes to all-out conflicts, but in recent years, coordination between Hezbollah, Lebanon, and the Palestinian factions has gotten better than it was before. The current Biden-led U.S. administration, which calls itself human rights supporters, is wary of the current Israeli government, refusing to take a pro-Israeli stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict, rather maintaining a neutral-like stance on the issue. These factors have further strengthened the courage of Hezbollah fighters, where they erected 2 military-style tents south of the Blue Line, the demarcation line between Israel, Lebanon, and Golan Heights. On another occasion in July, some men wearing face masks, military fatigues, and carrying Hezbollah's yellow flag approached or climbed the security barrier separating the two countries. Since then, the border has also witnessed an increased trend of provocative actions from the Hezbollah faction. In one case, an Israeli surveillance camera was destroyed, and instances of throwing stones and starting a fire are on the rise. There were 2 other serious incidents reported earlier this year. In March, a militant managed to cross into Israel, detonating a roadside bomb 57 kilometers south of the Blue Line that injured 1 person. Even though no organization has taken responsibility for the blast, IDF suspects Hezbollah is to blame. And in April, the biggest salvo of rockets since the 2006 war was fired from Lebanon into Israel in response to Israeli police raids on Jerusalem's Holy Aqsa Mosque compound. While it is believed that the missiles were launched by Palestinian factions based in Lebanon, they almost certainly acted in coordination with Hezbollah, which controls most of the country's south. As far as Israel is concerned, Hezbollah has become a serious threat again, and rightfully so, because reports suggest that Hezbollah now has an estimated 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel. UNIFIL has emphasized the extreme sensitivity of the situation and warned that if this persists, things can escalate pretty quickly. There's a school of thought that believes Israel's current political crisis is what is encouraging Hezbollah's recent offensive strikes. There's another that speculates Iran is playing the devil's advocate by convincing the group to take more and more risks. And you know what? All of it may well be true. Israel might be vulnerable. The ongoing war with Palestine, where militants launched land, sea, and air attacks, is taking a toll on Israeli defense forces. And to make matters worse, Israel is currently going through internal political problems, a housing crisis, and inflation. Even though the United States and others have expressed their solidarity with Israel, their relationship with the U.S. has deteriorated since the Biden administration. The conflict extends beyond Israel and Lebanon. The entire Middle East, which significantly improved its relations with Israel in the recent years, is keeping a watchful eye on developments here. Any spark in this powder keg could trigger a series of far-reaching consequences, impacting neighboring nations and global dynamics. For the people of Israel and Lebanon, the path to a more stable future remains uncertain. They have endured decades of conflict, and their resilience is both remarkable and inspiring. Ultimately, the choices made by their leaders and the international community will shape the destiny of this troubled region.